Lights up.
Why should my banker, Morgan Stanley, have fewer rights than my barber, Stanley Morgan?
It's the subject of jokes.
Now they'll both be able to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on ads attacking banking regulations.
How the big bucks spent on K Street drown out the little guy on Main Street. But many say the money is no laughing matter.
It's a fine line between a campaign contribution and a bribe, and that line is what keeps you out of jail. In order to run for office in America, we've got a system set up where private funds account for the bulk of the money.
So what would it take for Americans to buy back Congress? Let's take a look at one group's estimate, all the big lobbying interests and corporate donations included. That's $50 million per U.S. senator, $5 billion to buy back the Senate, and another $20 million per congressman. That's $8.7 billion to buy back the House of Representatives. Put it all together, and $14 billion is what it would take to buy back an entire branch of the U.S. government. Big dollar donations are nothing new. Congress passed its first campaign contribution limits in the early 1970s.
We held one presidential election campaign under those limits in 1976, and immediately thereafter, candidates began finding ways around those contribution limits.
The amount of money spent by lobbyists has more than doubled over the last decade, to a record $3.5 billion in 2010.
This presents a threat of corruption.
Thanks to a 2010 Supreme Court decision, that fundraising can now include unlimited corporate donations.
My candidacy will be officially known as the Hail to the Cheese, Stephen Colbert Nacho Cheese Doritos 2008 presidential campaign!
Of course, not all politicians have the same price tag. California's Barbara Boxer is the priciest senator at $2.3 million. Followed by Harry Reid, John McCain, and Tea Party darling Marco Rubio.
I come from a hard-working and humble family, one that was neither wealthy nor connected.
Who's raked in $21.7 million as a freshman senator.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you for running.
In the House, Michelle Bachmann leads with $13.5 million, much of which comes from big oil, which may explain her stance on drilling.
Whether that is in the Everglades or whether that is in the Eastern Gulf region or whether that is in North Dakota, we need to go where the energy is.
And when corporations pay big,
those of us who can't afford to write a $20,000 check, we're left out in the cold.
Can't shell out to buy a congressman full-time? Why not rent him for a hearing? One American investor shelled out $2,400 to Elliot Engel.
Mr. Cerna.
$2,400 to Dan Burton. Connie Mack got $500.
Mr. Oscar Cerna.
Mr. Oscar Cerna.
Oscar Serena.
And made his cement company the center of a human rights hearing on post-coup Honduras. Both cheap and expensive, but out of reach for the average American.
The public needs to know the decisions that are being made, are they being made because of the merits of the proposal at hand, or is it a perk that is due to some sort of backroom deal?
But with plenty on the budgetary chopping block of the Debt Super Committee, many expect lobbying dollars will once again set the agenda.
Ohio Governor John Kasich made history yesterday as Ohio became the first state in the history of this country to sell a state-owned prison to a for-profit private corporation. The Lake Erie Correctional Institute opened up in 2000, and at the end of this year will be officially owned and operated by the Corrections Corporation of America, also known as CCA, which shelled out $72 million to buy the facility from the state and will now get paid for every single new prisoner they lock up. CCA is the largest private prison corporation in America and made over $430 million in the last quarter of this year. And the guy who runs Ohio's Department of Rehabilitation and Correction and is thus in charge of overseeing the state's prison is a guy named Gary Moore, who just happens to be a former employee of CCA. But CCA is no stranger to getting what it wants, namely more prisoners to lock up for more profits. As a member of the right-wing American Legislative Exchange Council, which writes tailor-made legislation on behalf of its corporate members to hand off to state legislators to turn into laws, CCA has spent years writing and pushing legislation for stricter laws to throw more and more people in prison, particularly stricter drug laws. It's simple. If your business depends on locking people up, then you're going to push for legislation to lock up more people, whether it's good for the criminal justice system or society or not. Today, the United States has more people in prison both as a percentage and in absolute numbers, than any other country in the developed world. And it appears the destructive nature of administering our criminal justice system based on a profit motive plays a huge role in our nation's exploding prison population, a fact that seems to elude Ohio Governor John Kasich. So how worrisome is it that corporate power is now creeping into the commons of our criminal justice system? And what are the consequences? Cliff Schechter joins me now. He's the National Progressive PR Strategist at Libertas LLC. Cliff, welcome back.
Thanks so much, Tom. How are you?
Just great. Before we get to this privatized prison, I know, Senate Bill 5, there's an awful lot going on in Ohio. You want to give us a quick thumbnail sketch of the democracy reaction movement that's going on in that state?
Well, it's amazing what's happened in reaction to Senate Bill 5. I mean, kind of like what you saw happen in Wisconsin, where 2 Republicans in deep red districts were recalled, and the Republicans almost lost the state Senate. We don't have that recall mechanism, so you've got the bill is going to be on the ballot here in November. And I think you and I have discussed before, they needed somewhere around 200,000, a little under signatures. They got 1.3 million. So you're seeing the same grassroots fire here that you saw in Wisconsin, where people are just sick of this, and they've seen, they've seen their livelihoods attacked. And in this state, excuse me, even more so than Wisconsin, they also took away collective bargaining rights from firefighters and policemen. So they even went a step further here, and they're suffering the backlash such that John Kasich has now tried to sit down and talk with people. Funny, he didn't want to do that before. I guess when you hit at a 30% approval rating or under, it's time to talk.
Yeah, I would guess. So privatizing a prison, who benefits from this?
Well, of course, private corporations. I mean, you had a great opening. The head of the rehabilitation and corrections here is, as you said, worked for CCA. CCA and GEO, the 2 biggest ones, made $2.9 billion last year. I mean, think about that for a second.
Is that revenue or profit?
They made, it was revenue, but I mean, it's just the fact that as Eisenhower warned us, of course, with a military-industrial complex, and this is no different. You talked about locking people up with war on drugs. What about the fact that these guys lobbied for the law in Arizona, SB 1070, because they wanted to create prisons specifically for illegal immigrants. That was what they were looking to do. They need more customers for their prisons. And again, this stuff's been proven a failure everywhere. In Florida, in Hernando County, for example, they had to actually, the prison there had to revert to the county because these guys did such a terrible job. And in the year after that, they saved $1 million. So this, it's a farcical notion that you save money with privatization of prisons. It just doesn't happen.
So John Kasich is pushing this thing, and he's presumably got the Republican legislature behind him.
Right.
First of all, does this require legislative action, or is this just something he can do as an executive order?
Just something he can do,
okay.
Quite sadly.
So is this about the money? Is this about the ideology? Is this, the camel's nose under the tent? Is this the first of many jails and prisons in Ohio that might be privatized? Is this something that's going to spread to other states around the area? Are there any indications of any of these things?
Yeah, well, a lot of things. You said Rick Scott, even in wake of the Florida case I talked about, still wants to privatize up to half of their prisons in Florida. As often you see with the right, things aren't mutually exclusive. It's more than one thing going on. One thing is ideologically, of course, these guys believe that, the sort of old Christian fundamentalist, punish everyone, throw them away, throw the key away, and lock them up. You've got that sort of that mentality going on, with the war on drugs and illegal immigrants and just sort of the police state that's the national security state that's kind of crept into how we treat people domestically. But also, corporations profit from this. Look, it's simple. As I said, look at the money that was made, in the last year by these 2 top guys. It doesn't include all the other players in this. This is what they want. This is their business model. I think right now almost 100,000 prisoners, I think 99,000 in this country, are in prisons privately controlled. Something like 264 facilities. And they plan to expand. I mean, again, how can you not see a conflict of interest in people that make money off of locking people up? One more thing. They have spent, I was just looking before, almost $7 million combined, most of it in states, to lobby, because it's the state legislatures that often give these guys what they want, and governors. But they've spent about $6 million of that $7 million, but $7 million overall. They're lobbying for tougher criminal statutes when it comes to drugs. They're lobbying for illegal immigrants, for prisons, as they call for illegal immigrants again. This is what they want. This is the country they want us to have. And it should be terrifying, really.
You need to know this. The United States Post Office is on the verge of shutting down. According to the New York Times today, the Post Office is quickly running out of cash and may be forced to shut down this winter. As the Times writes, sometime early next year, the agency will run out of money to pay its employees and gas up its trucks, forcing it to stop delivering the roughly 3 billion pieces of mail it handles weekly. Postmaster General Patrick R. Donahoe described the situation as extremely serious and warned, if Congress doesn't act, we will default. So what's going on here? Why is the Post Office, which was created by Ben Franklin more than 200 years ago, on the verge of shuttering its doors today? While the media storyline is that the Post Office is dealing with the problem of trying to remain profitable in a world of decreasing paper mail, the real cause is actually something much, much different. Consider that this year, like every year since 2006, the Post Office is legally required to make a $5 billion annual contribution to a retirement account to pay for future retirees who are not yet even born. No other company or government agency has been asked to do anything this crazy. Yet that's exactly what Congress, during the presidency of George W. Bush, forced the Post Office to do. And now this poison pill legislation from 5 years ago has pushed the Post Office to the verge of not being able to pay its bills. So is this really just another example of conservatives manufacturing a crisis so that they can privatize another essential government service? For more on this, I'm joined by Chuck Zlatkin, legislative and political director of the New York Metro Area Postal Union. Chuck, welcome.
Hello, Tom, and thank you for having me on your program.
Thanks for joining us. Is it true that under this piece of legislation that was passed by a voice vote in Congress, we don't even have a record of who voted how, other than that, it was a voice vote, Republicans running the show, that 75 years of retirement funding by the Post Office has to be paid off in a 10-year period? Do I have that right?
That is correct, but it really has to do with just one portion of retirement benefits. It's the health care benefits for future retirees that this legislation, as you aptly put, require the Postal Service to fully fund it within a 10-year period, which means that the Postal Service is $5.5 billion, in the hole before it sells one stamp each year. But as outrageous as this is, it's not all of what's been done to the Postal Service by congressional mandates.
Now, the guy who wrote this legislation, Tom Davis, UPS is one of his major lifetime donors. Tom DeLay, the floor whip, UPS is one of his major lifetime donors, one of his top 4 donors, as I recall. Denny Hastert, Speaker of the House at the time, they were one of his top 15 donors, as I recall, or in the top 20. Might that have something to do with this Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act? Or was this just, ideology? Let's just take down the Post Office. Or was there some actual legitimate reason to do this?
Well, I think the long-term goal of many people involved with the planning of this has been to eventually privatize the Postal Service, because they know that's an essential service even in the Internet era, and that what irked them is that the Postal Service has 600,000 workers who are gaining a living wage and benefits in retirement. They're unionized workers, and postal management is carrying out the wishes of people who say, wait a minute, if we get rid of these unions and the unionized workers, we can replace them with at-will workers, hourly wage workers with no benefits, and not that that money would go to the government or the people in the United States. It would go to to profiteers, because
to the CEOs.
We all have to.
So I'm going to end up with a situation where the checks that I might get in the mail, whether they're their current business deals or future retirement checks are being delivered by a guy who's working a pizza job in the evening to supplement his income?
Right, and one thing that's true about postal workers, because I know, because I've gone through it, is we are vetted. I mean, getting a job in the Postal Service is something that it really requires someone with a good background. I don't think Darrell Issa could qualify for a job.
Right,
in the
and
Postal
Darrell
Service.
Issa is one of the guys who's pushing for one of these things to nail this thing down. I'm sorry to move us along. We just have about a minute and a half left, Chuck, and I want to get as much in as possible. How come the New York Times didn't include this information in their article today?
Well, they either buried it or wanted to mislead it, because the New York Times is carrying out the message. They didn't talk about H.R. 1351, which is Stephen Lynch's legislation that has 183 co-sponsors that would basically solve this problem. It would take the overpayment into the retirement fund and move it into the obligation for the future retirees' health benefits. It wouldn't cost the taxpayers anything, and it would basically free up $5.5 billion a year for the Postal Service to do its job, which is to protect universal service for everybody who needs it, and to deliver the mail that it's been doing for 236 years.
And in fact is the only institution that is actually defined in the Constitution. So this is a problem that has a solution. The solution is in legislation. The legislation is in the House. I'm guessing that the Republicans are not going to be real enthusiastic about passing this, and they're going to try and push this until 2013. We have about 20 seconds left, Chuck.
Well, we just need people to call their representatives and ask them to co-sponsor H.R. 1351 and thank them if they already had this bipartisan support for this legislation. It's the answer. The Postal Service will be fine, and then we can go on to taking care of the real problems that have to be dealt with, not the manufactured ones.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Appreciate it. Appreciate your dropping by.
Thank you, Tom.
If you want to save the United States Postal Service that's as old as America itself, as Chuck said, you need to call your congressman or woman and tell him or her to stop the right-wing assault on the Postal Service part of our common.